In session 21 here, we're going to take a look at multiplication, and in particular, how you multiply numbers when they include negative numbers. Let's just go ahead and start off, though, with something very straightforward. What if we had the problem 3 times 2? Now remember, the symbols, you don't see any negative symbols in front of either of these two numbers. Neither do you see any positives. So by default, if neither symbol is written, these are positives. But if you remember from before, earlier in an earlier session, one way of thinking about multiplication is repeated division. So let's take our first number here, the 3. It's being multiplied by 2, so it's being added twice. 3 times 2 is the same thing as 3 plus 3. What if I had 5 times 3? Take our first number, 5, and how many times is it being used as an addend? 3 times. So 5 times 3 would be 5 plus 5 plus 5. Coming up to our first example again of 3 times 2, both of these numbers are positive, and it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple to see that whenever you multiply two positive numbers together, your answer likewise is going to be positive. Now, in our example here of where we went 5 times 3 equals 5 plus 5 plus 5, what if instead our question was minus 5 times 3? Now, is this 3 a minus, a negative, or a positive? Well, it's a positive, even though there's not a positive right before it. It's implied. So we have a negative 5 times a 3. Well, if we use that repeated addition illustration, that would be negative 5 plus negative 5 plus another negative 5. Well, what is negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5? Well, the answer to that question is negative 15. So we can see here by a simple illustration that when you have a negative number and you multiply it by a positive number, your answer is going to be negative. I must admit I don't have a good example to show you when you have a negative number being multiplied by a negative number. You're just going to have to memorize this one. A negative number times a negative number is going to yield you a positive answer. So here, in our first example, we had a positive times a positive. And what did that give us as an answer? It gave us a positive answer. In our second example here, we had a negative times a positive. And what did that give us as an answer? It gave us a negative as an answer. And in the last one, a negative times a negative is a positive. Just as well as a positive times a positive being a positive. And maybe if you are somewhat familiar with double negatives in English, a double negative actually makes a positive. So maybe that's a good way for you to remember that when you have two negatives being multiplied together, it's the same thing as a positive. Just as in English, a double negative actually makes a positive. Before we move to the review, let me just call off a few examples here for you to do as you're watching the video. What I want you to tell me is whether the answer to this problem is negative or positive. Negative 2 times negative 2. Well, that'll be a positive because a negative times a negative is a positive. Negative 1 times 1. Well, that'll be negative because a negative times a positive gives you a negative answer. 3 times 11. Well, that'll be positive because a positive times a positive is positive. And I guess I'll just toss one more out here that we can do visually on screen here. When you are multiplying together numbers and you have negatives and positives mixed together, or negatives with negatives or whatever, what you simply do is you just sort of ignore those for the moment. And then what you do is you just take the numbers as they stand and multiply them together. So if I had a minus 7 times a 6, that's actually a positive 6. For the moment, I'm going to ignore my negative and my positive. What is 7 times 6? Well, 7 times 6 is 42. Now, is my answer going to be a positive 42 or a negative 42? That's where I now come back and take a look at my signs. I have a negative 7 here and a positive 6 here. A negative times a positive is going to be negative. So my answer is negative 42. Okay, over on the review page, it simply tells you a positive number multiplied by a positive number will give you a positive answer. A positive number multiplied by a negative number, or a negative number multiplied by a positive number, will give you a negative answer. And lastly, a negative number multiplied by a negative number will give you a positive answer. That's the end of session 21.